There comes a time in the life of every individual when the pursuit of approval becomes tiresome. A deeper voice calls, not from the world, but from within. It beckons you to descend inward into the forgotten corridors of your being. This is the beginning of self-love, not the surface kind, but the alchemical process of becoming whole. You will meet your shadow there. The parts of yourself you once denied, avoided, or feared. And in accepting these fragments, not in shame, but in compassion, you begin to gather your essence. Individuation is the central process of becoming who you truly are. It is not a linear journey, but rather a spiral descent into the self, where one must encounter, engage with, and integrate the many facets of the psyche. At its essence, individuation is self-love in its most honest, transformative, and enduring form. It is not about narcissism or self-indulgence. It is about facing your truth and emerging whole. To love oneself truly is not merely to affirm the surface qualities, but to embrace the totality of one's being, including the rejected, broken, and hidden aspects that society and conditioning have taught us to suppress. When a person embarks on the path of individuation, they begin by confronting the illusion of identity they have carried for years. Most people live through the persona, the mask worn to gain social acceptance and survive in the collective. While this mask serves a purpose, it is not the self. It is a sliver of it, molded by expectation and necessity. The act of self-love begins when one dares to remove the persona and look beneath it, not to discard it, but to see how much of the true self has been hidden behind it. This willingness to look inward, to question inherited beliefs and emotional patterns, is the first movement of individuation. True self-love does not flinch at discomfort. It is willing to descend into the shadow, the repository of traits, feelings, and impulses we disown because they do not fit our ideal image. The shadow is not evil. It is simply unconscious. To love oneself fully, one must meet this darkness, not to be consumed by it, but to understand it, dialogue with it, and ultimately integrate it. When we refuse to acknowledge our shadow, it dominates us from beneath. But when we turn toward it with awareness, we reclaim our energy and become less fragmented. This reunion of lost parts is an act of profound inner care. Individuation teaches that love of self is not passive acceptance, but active engagement with the soul's unfolding. It requires discernment, the ability to know what belongs to your truth and what has been imposed upon you. As one differentiates from family roles, cultural programming, and unconscious patterns, one begins to recognize the contours of the authentic self. This recognition brings clarity and with it a sense of responsibility, not to conform but to live from the inner center. This fidelity to self is love in action. As the process continues, the archetypes within, the wise elder, the wounded child, the sacred inner feminine and masculine, begin to emerge and communicate. Each represents a part of the psyche that has longed for attention. Listening to them and integrating their insights helps to form a more complete, more harmonious internal world. This deep listening is not something we do for others. It is what we do for ourselves when we finally consider ourselves worthy of being heard. And that is love. So, individuation demands solitude, silence, and the courage to be misunderstood. It often leads us away from the collective current and into the wilderness of our own thoughts and instincts. But this is where one finds the soul's voice. To walk this path is to affirm that you are not here merely to replicate the lives of others, but to live in alignment with your own nature. Such authenticity can only arise from a foundation of radical self-respect. To individuate is to become fully human. It is to say, I accept all of me, not just the light, but the pain, the fear, the longing. I will not abandon myself again. This inner vow is the highest expression of self-love, not a fleeting emotion but a lifelong commitment to wholeness. Shadow work filters relationships because it changes the very foundation upon which we connect with others. As individuation progresses and the self is loved more fully, there comes a natural confrontation with the shadow, the unconscious aspects of the psyche that hold repressed fears, desires, emotions, and impulses. These are the traits we deny in ourselves, often projecting them onto others. Before engaging in shadow work, much of our relational life is unconsciously shaped by these projections. We attract people not because they are aligned with our conscious values, but because they reflect aspects of ourselves we haven't yet owned. When you begin to face your shadow, you start pulling back the projections you've cast onto others. That person you thought was a too controlling may, in fact, mirror your own resistance to surrender. That friend you called dramatic might embody an emotional honesty you fear in yourself. As these projections are reclaimed, the emotional charge around certain people dissipates. They no longer hold the same pull or push over you because the magnet was inside your own unconscious all along. This insight alone begins to filter your relationships, not by force, but through clarity. Before shadow work, the psyche often seeks out familiarity over health. It is drawn to relationships that repeat unresolved emotional patterns. What feels familiar tends to feel safe, even if it's toxic. You might attract people who trigger your abandonment wound, not because you want pain, but because the psyche is trying to recreate the old wound in hopes of resolving it. Without awareness, this becomes a loop. Shadow work breaks the loop by making the unconscious pattern conscious. Once you see it, you can choose differently. This is how love for self transforms relationship dynamics. It interrupts the cycle of repetition. Facing your shadow also cultivates inner boundaries. You begin to recognize when someone is not responding to you, but to their own projections. And more importantly, you recognize when you are doing the same to them. This makes space for more honest interactions. Instead of blaming others for emotional triggers, you turn inward and ask, what part of me is being activated? That level of ownership filters out codependency and emotional manipulation. It fosters mutual growth rather than mutual projection. As your internal awareness deepens, you naturally become less tolerant of relationships built on illusion. Conversations that once felt stimulating now feel hollow. Connections that once thrilled you may now feel draining. This isn't because others have changed. It's because your lens has. You no longer need others to complete you, validate you, or reflect your wounds. This reduces emotional hunger and increases emotional discernment. And when neediness dissolves, discernment grows. You begin to see people as they are, not as your shadow needs them to be. Some relationships may fall away, not out of judgment, but because the glue that held them together, mutual wounding, has melted. What once bonded you in shared dysfunction no longer has gravity. This can be painful. It can feel like a kind of death. But it is also the birth of clearer connection, of relationships rooted not in trauma but in truth. The space that opens is not empty, it is fertile. Into that space, individuals who resonate with your evolving self begin to arrive. They arrive not because you have sought them out with desperation, but because your internal world has shifted. You are no longer broadcasting pain. You are emanating presence. And those who recognize that frequency are often those doing their own inner work. The relationship becomes a meeting of sovereign beings rather than two halves searching for completion. It becomes a space of reflection, not projection. As you continue integrating the shadow and embracing your whole self, the relationships that remain or emerge will do the same. In this way, shadow work doesn't just change who you are, it transforms the very landscape of your connections. When shadow work has been initiated and projections begin to dissolve, the natural evolution is towards self-realization, the awareness and embodiment of the true self. This shift has profound consequences, especially on how attraction operates in our lives. Attraction is not merely a physical or emotional phenomenon. It is psychological and energetic. The way we attract people into our orbit is deeply influenced by our self-concept and unconscious motivations. As you begin to realize the truth of who you are beyond the patterns and personas, your energetic signature changes, and so too does the kind of attention you receive from others. Before self-realization, much of our attraction is based on what the psyche unconsciously seeks to resolve. If we feel unworthy, we may be drawn to people who withhold affection, hoping unconsciously to win the love we once lacked. If we carry unresolved anger or shame, we may gravitate toward people who mirror that tension, either by provoking us or suffering with us. These dynamics are not conscious choices, they are psychic compulsions. But as you begin to see yourself more clearly, without the distortions of ego, shame, or social conditioning, these compulsions lose their grip. Attraction shifts from survival and repetition to resonance and alignment. This shift is not subtle. People you once chased now seem emotionally irrelevant. Relationships that once excited you now feel chaotic or one-sided. The highs and lows that used to feel like passion now resemble emotional instability. This is not cynicism, it's clarity. When the self becomes realized, it stops searching for fulfillment in others because it no longer feels fundamentally incomplete. That fullness radiates outward, and only those who are also on a path toward wholeness are drawn to it. The language of attraction becomes quieter, more refined, more discerning. Self-realization also rewires what we find appealing. The external traits that once captivated us, status, appearance, charm, lose their power when we no longer need them to compensate for inner emptiness. Instead, qualities like emotional honesty, inner peace, and psychological depth become magnetic. You begin to see beauty in stillness, in vulnerability and truth. And in that shift, you stop being attracted to people who only stimulate your ego and start being drawn to those who speak to your soul. This evolution also makes you less likely to tolerate misalignment. When you are no longer seeking validation, manipulation loses its leverage. When you are not performing for affection, attention becomes irrelevant, unless it is rooted in mutual respect. You begin to understand that chemistry alone is not enough, that real attraction must be supported by emotional maturity and shared value. The pull toward those who are emotionally unavailable, manipulative, or unhealed fades, not because you judge them, but because your system no longer resonates with that frequency. This doesn't mean that challenges disappear, but the nature of those challenges changes. You are no longer entangled in cycles of abandonment, betrayal, or confusion. Instead, your connections become mirrors, offering reflection rather than projection. The people who now enter your life come not to fill a void, but to walk alongside your path. Their presence complements rather than completes you. The attraction is not electric in the destabilizing sense. It is grounding, steady, and rooted in shared authenticity. As you grow into self-realization, your relationships stop being reactions and start becoming conscious choices. The old magnetic pull to dysfunction is replaced with a gentle recognition of mutual truth. You feel seen, not for your potential, but for your presence. And because you no longer seek others to define you, you can finally see in others clearly. Attraction becomes less about fantasy and more about reality, who someone truly is, not who you want them to be. And just like that, what you are drawn to changes. Who you attract changes because you have changed. As self-realization deepens and the external need for validation dissolves, the inner world begins to call louder for integration. The psyche, always moving toward wholeness, turns inward to reconcile the polarities with. Among the most vital of these is the integration of the anima and animus, the inner feminine and inner masculine energies that live in all people regardless of gender. These archetypes, once unconscious, begin to reveal themselves more clearly as the individual grows into their authentic self, shifting attraction further into alignment with true psychological balance. The anima represents the inner feminine, the emotional, intuitive, receptive, and relational qualities of the psyche. The animus embodies the inner masculine, logical, assertive, active, and structured forces within. These energies are not about gender roles or stereotypes, but about symbolic polarities that need each other to form a complete psychological system. In the unconscious person, these inner figures are projected outward. A man unaware of his anima might be irresistibly drawn to women who embody his unconscious feminine ideal. A woman, disconnected from her animus, might seek out men who reflect the strength, direction, or rationality she hasn't cultivated within herself. These projections can create intense, romanticized connections, ones that feel like destiny, but are often riddled with conflict and unmet expectations. That's because the psyche is not engaging with the real person, but with a symbol of its own disowned energy. However, when a person begins to integrate these archetypes, the nature of their attraction evolves. The inner anima teaches a man to be more in touch with his emotions, to listen, to intuit, and to relate with depth and empathy. The inner animus helps a woman develop clarity, boundaries, and the ability to express herself with authority and confidence. When these inner energies are recognized and brought into balance, relationships stop being a means of compensation. You no longer seek a partner to fulfill what you lack because you have begun to embody those qualities yourself. The need to find your other half fades, not from isolation, but from inner completion. The self becomes androgynous in the psychological sense, capable of both strength and softness, of direction and surrender. Attraction becomes grounded in mutual respect rather than idealization. You are drawn not to those who compensate for your imbalance, but to those who echo your integration. This balance also enhances discernment. A man who has integrated his anima can see beyond surface beauty or emotional volatility. He is no longer entranced by projection because he has made peace with the emotional depths within himself. A woman who has integrated her animus can stand firm in her power without seeking external protection or authority. She does not fall for dominance masquerading as strength because she has developed that strength internally. In both cases, the inner marriage between anima and animus filters out relationships built on fantasy and fosters those rooted in reality. Such integration creates a powerful psychological symmetry that radiates outward. People sense wholeness in someone who has reconciled their inner opposites. It is not a loud or performative energy, but a quiet solidity that attracts from the core. This balance also invites others to do the same. Relationships formed from this space are less about possession and more about partnership. They are not defined by need, but by shared purpose and growth. Each individual comes to the relationship whole, not to be completed, but to create something larger together. When the inner feminine and masculine walk side by side within you, the external dynamics of connection shift. You no longer seek in others what you have not yet given yourself. Instead, attraction becomes a reflection, not of desire for fulfillment, but of resonance with another who has done the same inner work. This psychic symmetry is the foundation of conscious connection, and it arises only when the animus are not just understood intellectually, but lived and integrated into your daily being. When the anima and animus begin to integrate within the psyche, a deeper level of self-awareness emerges, one that naturally brings attention to the contrast between the persona and the true self. The persona is the mask crafted for the world, a selective identity formed through social roles, family expectations, cultural conditioning, and adaptive behaviors. It is necessary, to some extent, for functioning in society. It helps navigate interactions, create first impressions, and maintain a sense of order in the external world. But it is not the self. It is only a fraction, often shaped to gain approval or avoid rejection. As the inner balance of the psyche strengthens, this distinction becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. In the earlier stages of life, and certainly before psychological integration, the persona often dominates. We learn to wear it like armor, adapting our speech, emotions, and desires to fit what others want to see. This persona becomes a kind of psychic currency, traded in exchange for acceptance and belonging. But as one comes into deeper contact with the inner self, through individuation, shadow work, and the reconciliation of inner polarities, this false identity begins to feel tight, hollow, even burdensome. The more authentic self pushes to be seen, to be expressed, not in rebellion, but as a natural unfolding of one's inner truth. When the persona is mistaken for the self, relationships are built on misrepresentation. People are attracted to the image, not the essence. But as the inner work progresses, the need to be perceived in a certain way begins to dissolve. The attention received for being likable, impressive, or successful loses its appeal because it is no longer feeding the core. The self now desires something truer, connection based not on presentation, but on presence. This shift is subtle at first, but becomes undeniable. You begin to crave interactions where you don't have to shrink or perform. You want to be met as you are, not as who you've taught yourself to be. Letting go of the persona is not an act of destruction, but of refinement. The individual no longer uses it to hide, but allows it to become transparent, a functional interface, not a disguise. In this way, the outer self aligns with the inner self, and when that alignment occurs, it acts as a filter for relationships. People who were once magnetized by your social role may fall away, unable to connect with the substance beneath the surface. Others who recognize and respect your authenticity begin to enter your life in quieter, more meaningful ways. This alignment between the outer and inner self also changes the nature of how one shows up in relationships. There is less fear of being misunderstood, because there is less effort to control perception. There is less dependency on approval, because the core no longer needs external confirmation to feel whole. The self, having reconciled its inner opposites, having accepted its own contradictions and complexities, no longer needs to be polished or simplified. it simply is. And in that state, it becomes deeply magnetic, attracting others who value depth over performance, honesty over image. The abandonment of the persona as identity liberates the psyche. It reclaims the energy once spent maintaining appearances and redirects it toward creation, expression, and presence. In this space, the self does not seek attention. It radiates clarity. And because others can feel that clarity, only those aligned with it will naturally remain or arrive. When someone is attracted to the true self, not the mask, the foundation of that bond is inherently stronger, freer, and more sustainable. There is no longer a need to be on, to manage impressions, or to play roles. There is only the experience of being, and being met by another who recognizes what is real. As the persona fades and the true self begins to guide one's life, perception itself transforms. The outer world is no longer seen as a disconnected sequence of events, but as a mirror, a field reflecting the inner state of consciousness. In this shift, the random becomes meaningful, and coincidence evolves into synchronicity. Unlike serendipity, which is often viewed as a happy accident or fortunate chance, synchronicity is precise, symbolic, and rooted in the alignment between the inner and outer worlds. It reveals itself not through logic, but through resonance, a felt recognition that something deeper is at play. When one is living through the persona, life often feels fragmented. Events happen, people come and go, and outcomes appear to be driven by external forces or luck. There is a chronic sense of chasing, of trying to make things work through effort, planning, and persuasion. But as the true self emerges and the inner world becomes more coherent, the external begins to organize itself differently. Patterns appear where there was once randomness. The people who show up in your life seem to arrive with messages, reflections, or invitations that perfectly match the state of your internal development. You begin to sense that life is not just happening to you, it is responding through you. This is synchronicity, a dialogue between the psyche and the world. It is not about causality, it is about meaning. When the unconscious has been engaged through shadow work, and the inner masculine and feminine have begun their integration, the psyche becomes more sensitive to symbols, archetypes, and signs. Dreams bleed into waking life. Encounters carry a charge, a sense of destiny, or symbolic relevance. These moments are not always comfortable, but they are always timely. They arrive with precision, not luck. In relationships, synchronicity plays an especially transformative role. Before inner integration, we often experience relationships through projection and repetition. We meet people who trigger old patterns or help us reenact unresolved wounds. But after significant inner work, we become more conscious of the symbolic purpose others may serve in our lives. Instead of labeling connections as a meant-to-be based on intensity or emotional highs, we begin to see them as mirrors or catalysts. A brief conversation can hold the same depth as a lifelong relationship if its timing and meaning are aligned. Attraction itself begins to shift from impulse to insight. One no longer falls into relationships out of hunger or habit, but recognizes when a meeting carries symbolic significance. The synchronicity of that encounter becomes the invitation, not necessarily to merge or possess, but to grow, to listen, to respond consciously. You begin to trust these connections, not because they promise comfort, but because they arrive with clarity. Serendipity offers pleasant surprises. Synchronicity delivers messages. This change in perception also cultivates greater patience and surrender. You no longer force interactions, chase opportunities, or manipulate outcomes. You trust the unfolding because you've experienced how the right people and circumstances appear when you are internally aligned. This isn't magical thinking, it's psycho-spiritual coherence. The world responds to the energy you hold, and the more aligned you are with your inner truth, the more precise the outer reflections become. The presence of synchronicity affirms that you are walking the path of the true self. It doesn't guarantee ease, but it does offer orientation. Each meaningful coincidence is a compass point guiding you further inward and forward. And in that state of presence, others who are also attuned begin to emerge. Their arrival doesn't feel accidental or urgent, it feels inevitable and calm. The connection carries weight, not because it's dramatic, but because it's real. Synchronicity becomes the language of the soul's unfolding, confirming that you no longer seek to find meaning. You are now living it. When one begins to live in synchronicity, Rather than in pursuit of coincidence, the psyche enters a state of profound coherence. The fragmentation caused by projection, persona, and unconscious compulsion starts to dissolve. In its place emerges a unified field of selfhood, an internal wholeness where opposites no longer battle but harmonize. This inner unity, this sense of being fully oneself without needing to explain, justify, or distort, emits a presence that is unmistakable. It is magnetic, not in the way of manipulation or charisma, but in the deeper sense of gravitational pull. Wholeness draws toward itself what reflects its integrity. People often chase love, attention, or validation by trying to become what they think others want. They craft identities, alter appearances, and adopt attitudes that promise connection but rarely deliver depth. This effort to attract is exhausting because it is rooted in a sense of lack. Wholeness, by contrast, does not seek to attract. It simply attracts. There is no effort in its expression, only alignment. The individual who is whole does not posture or pursue. They resonate, and resonance is far more powerful than effort. This kind of magnetism cannot be faked. It arises only when the psyche has gone through the alchemical fire of integration, when the shadow has been confronted, the anima and animus acknowledged, and the persona placed in service of the true self. Each part of the self, once split or exiled, has been invited home. This process creates depth, presence, and stability. Others feel this depth even if they cannot name it. They sense the lack of chaos in your energy, the absence of desperation, the fullness that needs nothing but honors everything. Wholeness also eliminates confusion in relationships. Because you are no longer fragmented, you do not send mixed signals. You do not say yes when you mean no, or tolerate dishonesty because you're afraid of being alone. You know who you are, and in that knowing, boundaries become natural, not rigid. Connection becomes fluid, not forced. People feel safe around wholeness, not because it caters to them, but because it is anchored. It does not seek to possess or be possessed. It invites, and only those who are ready for such presence will respond. There is a sacred stillness in wholeness, a kind of quiet confidence that cannot be manufactured. This stillness draws others who are also on the path of integration. It repels those who are not yet ready, not through exclusion or judgment, but because there is no longer a hook for their projections to cling to. The emotional chaos, the familiar drama, the seductive instability that once defined relationships can no longer survive in the field of wholeness. Only authenticity, mutual growth, and emotional honesty are sustained in that space. You begin to notice that the people who enter your life feel different. They don't come with masks or manipulation. They come with depth, curiosity, and a sense of presence that mirrors your own. There may be fewer connections, but they are richer. The relationships are no longer about need, but about mutual recognition. You are not halves seeking completion. You are wholes, meeting in the fullness of your being, ready to co-create rather than codepend. This magnetism is not loud. It does not announce itself. It simply is. It radiates from within and organizes the external world in response. Synchronicity becomes more frequent, not because you are lucky, but because you are clear. People are drawn not to your image, but to your essence. And in this quiet gravity, the relationships that arrive do not pull you off center, they meet you there. Because wholeness calls to wholeness, and only those attuned to that call will answer. When one truly loves themselves, not in fleeting affirmation, but in the profound, often silent labor of inner integration, life itself begins to shift. No longer ruled by projection, compulsion, or the need to be seen, the individual becomes whole, and that wholeness becomes a living force. The path inward, through shadow, through the anima and animus beyond the persona, reveals not only the truth of who we are, but also filters who is meant to walk beside us. Attraction is no longer chemistry born of chaos. It is recognition born of clarity. Serendipity is replaced by synchronicity. Validation is replaced by alignment. Performance is replaced by presence. And in this still, magnetic field of selfhood, only those who resonate with your truth will arrive, not to complete you, but to meet you.